I sat silently in the front pew of the church, my hands neatly folded in my lap, my eyes fixed on the smooth, polished mahogany coffin at the altar. Inside it was my mother, the woman I'd spent my entire life trying to impress. She was the one who had, in the end, made it painfully clear that I would never be enough. Tears pricked at my eyes, but they weren't tears of grief. No, they were tears of closure, the kind I knew I'd never truly get. Beside me, my sister Madeline sniffled dramatically, dabbing her eyes with a lace-trimmed handkerchief. She had always had a way of making everything about herself, and even now she was doing it. When the priest finished his final blessing, Madeline let out a soft, almost theatrical sob, leaning into her husband, Ethan, who wrapped an arm around her in a comforting gesture. She looked perfect, too perfect, as always. Her designer black dress fit her like it was made for her blonde curls falling in waves of controlled elegance. Even in the midst of a funeral, she still managed to turn heads. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my emotions in check, and glanced toward the second row where my aunt and uncle sat. They were stiff, deliberately avoiding my gaze. The rest of the family was the same. They all knew, and they all knew I had prepared myself for this moment. I had told myself I wouldn't care, but nothing could have prepared me for the lawyer's words after the service. "I'm sorry, Rebecca," Mr. Holloway said, adjusting his glasses as he flipped through the pages of my mother's will. "Your parents left everything to Madeline." A cold numbness swept through me, replacing the ache that had been building in my chest. "Everything?" I asked, my voice remarkably steady despite the storm brewing inside. "Yes." He hesitated before adding, "Your parents believed you were independent enough and didn't require financial support. Madeline, as a stay-at-home mom, needed it more." I dug my nails into the fabric of my dress, trying to hold myself together. Madeline already had 3 properties, a husband with a 6-figure salary, and a driveway full of luxury cars. Meanwhile, I had worked tirelessly through college, balancing 2 jobs, never once asking for a handout. And yet, I was considered unworthy. "That's ridiculous," Aunt Gloria muttered, breaking the tension that had settled over the room. But Madeline didn't even flinch. She let out a delicate sigh, as if this was just another burden she had to endure. "I mean, it does make sense," Madeline said softly, placing her hand over mine, her voice warm with false sympathy. "You've always been so independent, Rebecca. Mom and Dad just wanted to help me, that's all." "That's all?" I repeated, pulling my hand away from hers, my words sharp. "You knew, didn't you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. Madeline bit her lip, her gaze shifting. They might have mentioned something before," she admitted, the truth slipping out. I wanted to scream, to rage at the injustice of it all, to demand how, even after death, my parents had found another way to remind me that I was never enough. But years of being the forgotten daughter had taught me that anger never changed anything. So instead, I smiled. If they thought I was independent before, they had no idea what I could do now. I turned to the lawyer. "Thank you for your time," I said smoothly, standing up and gathering my purse. "But I won't be contesting the will." Madeline's brows furrowed. "Wait, you're not upset?" I gave her a long, calculated look, then tilted my head slightly. "Oh, Liv," I murmured, stepping closer so only she could hear. "I don't need their money." She visibly relaxed, mistaking my words for surrender. I turned on my heel and walked out of that office with my head held high. What Madeline didn't know, what nobody knew, was that I had already prepared my own final gift for our dear parents, and it was going to be unforgettable. I wasn't always invisible to my parents, or at least I didn't think I was. There must have been a time, maybe when I was a toddler, tugging at my mother's skirt or babbling to my father in a way they understood, when they truly saw me. But as I got older, the difference between Madeline and me became impossible to ignore. She was the golden child, the darling daughter who could do no wrong. And me? I was the afterthought. It started small. When Madeline won her first dance recital at 6, my parents threw a huge celebration, complete with a cake shaped like ballet slippers. When I won first place in a spelling bee that same year, my mother patted me on the head and told me to keep up the good work. When Madeline turned 16, she was gifted a brand new car, complete with a giant red bow. When I turned 16, I got a used bike because, "You don't really go out much anyway, Rebecca," my dad said with a shrug. I convinced myself that it didn't matter, that I didn't need their approval, admiration, or love. But deep down, it still hurt. I worked relentlessly while Madeline coasted through life on charm and parental favoritism. I built my own life from the ground up. I worked 2 part-time jobs to put myself through college. I landed a steady job in finance, saved every penny, and invested wisely. I never leaned on anyone. And yet, in the end, it didn't matter. That night, I sat in my small apartment, staring at the ceiling, the lawyer's words echoing in my mind. "Your parents left everything to Madeline." Of course they did. Why would I expect anything different? My phone buzzed, snapping me out of my thoughts. It was a message from Aunt Gloria. "Rebecca, I just want you to know that what your parents did was disgusting. You deserve better." A second message came through. "You should fight this. Contest the will. It's not fair. Fair." The word made me laugh. Nothing about my relationship with my parents had ever been fair. I had accepted a lot of things over the years, but what I couldn't bring myself to accept was Madeline sitting there, acting like this was just another minor inconvenience for her. She was pretending she hadn't known I didn't want their money. But that didn't mean I wouldn't leave my own mark on their legacy. I pulled open my laptop, quickly logging into my email. There was someone I needed to reach, someone who could help me make sure this injustice didn't go unpunished. A week later, I found myself standing in front of my parents' house. No, Madeline's house now. The familiar smells were still there. Freshly cut grass, the delicate hint of my mother's lavender perfume, deeply embedded in the walls. But it wasn't home anymore. It hadn't been for a long time. Madeline opened the door, her face lighting up with surprise. "Rebecca, I wasn't expecting you." No, of course she wasn't. "I need to pick up a few things," I said, keeping my voice casual. "Mom had some personal letters and keepsakes I'd like to have." Madeline hesitated, then stepped aside and gestured me in. "Of course, take whatever you need." I walked slowly through the house, every room filled with memories that hit me like waves. The living room, where I watched my parents dote on Madeline, the dining room table where I sat in silence while they fawned over her accomplishments. Finally, I made my way to my father's old study. This was why I was here. I opened the desk drawer, running my fingers over old papers, notebooks, and letters until I found it. The original version of my parents' will. I had already seen the copy the lawyer read aloud, but this one was different. The first page contained a clause that had never been in the final document. A clause that stated my parents' estate was supposed to be split evenly between Madeline and me. A slow, deliberate breath escaped me as my fingers tightened around the paper. So Madeline hadn't just accepted the favoritism. She had altered the will to her advantage. My heart raced as I turned to face her. Madeline was standing in the doorway, arms crossed, her expression annoyingly calm, almost bored. "You weren't supposed to see that," she said, her tone flat. I stared at her, waiting for an explanation, a confession, anything. But instead, she simply shrugged. "Mom and Dad always intended for me to have everything, Rebecca," she said, her voice dripping with smugness. "I just made sure their wishes were properly carried out." I had never despised her more than I did in that moment. I could have screamed, could have fought, could have gone straight to a lawyer and exposed her for what she'd done. But I didn't. Instead, I smiled, keeping my composure. "Thank you for your honesty," I said, my voice unwavering. "That's all I needed to know." With that, I turned and walked out of the house, my mind already working on my next move. Madeline had just made a massive mistake. She thought I would just let this slide. She thought I was still the same girl who had always been overlooked. But she was about to learn how wrong she was. The truth had been right there all along, buried in my father's desk, waiting for me to find it. My parents had intended for the estate to be split between Madeline and me, but Madeline had made sure that never happened. She hadn't just accepted her golden child status, she had taken everything, ensuring I was left with nothing. She thought I would do what I always did, swallow it, accept it, move on. But she had no idea who she was dealing with. I spent the next week planning my move. I could have gone straight to a lawyer and fought the will in court, But legal battles were slow, complicated, and Madeline was always careful. By now, I was certain she had covered her tracks. No, this called for something else, something that would hurt her where it mattered most. I just needed the right person to help me. I found him at an old bar downtown, the kind with dim lighting, where the scent of whiskey clung to the wooden walls like a second skin. "Hello, Ethan," I said, sliding into the booth across from Madeline's husband. Ethan looked up, clearly startled. He hadn't expected me. "Rebecca?" He frowned, setting his drink down. "What are you doing here?" I folded my hands on the table, leaning in closer. "I know about the will." His entire body froze. "What?" I kept my voice low, ensuring no one could overhear. "I know Madeline changed it. I found the original version in Dad's study. My parents wanted me to have half of everything, but Madeline made sure that didn't happen." Ethan let out a deep, slow breath, rubbing his hand across his face. He didn't seem surprised in the least. "You knew?" I asked, the words coming out sharper than I intended. He sighed, his gaze drifting to his glass. "I had my suspicions," he admitted. "But Madeline, she controls everything, the finances, the house, the accounts. I don't ask questions anymore." Of course he didn't. Madeline had always worn the pants in their marriage. Ethan had just followed along, like a passive passenger on her ride. But I wasn't here to judge him. I was here to use him. "Listen," I said, my voice softening. "I don't care about the money. I never have." Ethan snorted, his face twisting in disbelief. "Madeline thinks you do." "Madeline thinks a lot of things," I said, my voice steady. "But she's wrong." I leaned forward, my eyes locking with his. "I don't want her money. I just want her to pay for what she did." Ethan studied me for a long moment. Then, to my surprise, he laughed. "God, I'd love to see that," he muttered, shaking his head. "But Madeline, she always wins, Rebecca. She's untouchable." "Not this time," I replied, my voice low and determined, because I knew something Madeline didn't, and I was about to use it to my advantage. Over the next week, I dug deeper into Madeline's seemingly flawless life. I wasn't interested in her bank accounts or property deeds. I wanted something more personal, something that could truly hurt her. It didn't take long to find it. Late one night, as I scrolled through her old social media posts, I stumbled upon it. A photo from 3 years ago of Madeline on a vacation to Italy with a group of friends. The problem? Ethan had never been on that trip. I clicked on the tagged names, and one caught my attention. A man named James Anderson. He wasn't just a friend. There was something much more to him. I scrolled through his account, digging into old comments and interactions, and there it was. A thread of flirtatious banter, inside jokes, late-night messages stretching across the years. Madeline had been cheating on Ethan, and she had been incredibly sloppy about it. I leaned back in my chair, my pulse quickening. This was it, my first move. The thing about revenge is that it isn't always about big, dramatic gestures. Sometimes it's about the quiet unraveling, the delicate tearing apart of everything they've worked to build. I quickly drafted a message and sent it to Ethan. No explanations, no words, just screenshots. The response was almost immediate. "Where did you get these?" "Does it matter?" I typed back. "You deserve to know the truth." A long pause followed, before his reply came. "Meet me tomorrow. We need to talk." I smiled to myself. Checkmate, Madeline. The next evening, I met Ethan at a quiet cafe on the outskirts of town. He was already there, sitting hunched over a cup of coffee, staring blankly at the table. As soon as he looked up and saw me, I could tell he had seen everything. I slid into the chair across from him, and for a moment, neither of us said a word. The air was thick, charged with something fragile, anger, disbelief, maybe even relief. "How long?" he asked, his voice rough, barely a whisper. I exhaled slowly. "Based on what I found, at least 4 years." Ethan gave a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Of course," he muttered, picking up his coffee, but his hands were trembling too much to take a sip. "I'm sorry you had to find out this way," I said, my voice surprisingly sincere. "No, you're not." His eyes locked onto mine. "You wanted me to know. You wanted this to happen." I didn't deny it. Yes, but only because Madeline deserves to be exposed. Exposed? He repeated, his tone sharp. She's been playing everyone, me, you, even my parents, right up until they died. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. And now what? What do you want from me, Rebecca? I leaned forward, my voice low but firm. I don't want your money. I don't want your pity. I just want to watch her world fall apart. Ethan studied me for a long time before a small, dark smile appeared on his lips. You're not the only one. We spent the next hour discussing every detail. Madeline's lies, her manipulation, the fake will. Ethan was angry, but not the explosive, out-of-control kind of anger. No, his was colder, more calculated, the kind of rage that would dismantle everything in its path. I want a divorce, he finally said, his voice steady, and I want full custody of the kids. It was a bold move, a calculated strike. Madeline had spent years cultivating a perfect image of herself, the loving wife, the devoted mother. She needed that image. But Ethan? He was about to rip it all away from her. The next morning, I watched from a distance as Ethan's lawyer arrived at Madeline's doorstep with the divorce papers. She answered the door in a silk robe, her hair styled just so, holding a steaming cup of coffee. But as soon as she saw the envelope, her face twisted into something unrecognizable. I wished I could hear her reaction, the shock, the panic. But instead, I just watched as her fingers tightened around the envelope, her knuckles going white. And then, for just a split second, she glanced around, not at Ethan, not at her children, but at the neighbors. She cared more about their opinions than about the fact that her marriage was crumbling before her eyes. Classic Madeline. I could have walked away at that moment, let Ethan handle the rest, but I wasn't finished. Madeline still thought she could control the narrative, that she could talk her way out of this the way she always had. She was wrong. That evening, I made sure of it. With just a few clicks, I uploaded the proof of her affair, screenshots, messages, photos, but I didn't send them to Ethan. I sent them to everyone who mattered to her, her mommy group chats, the charity board, even the homeowners association. The fallout was swift. Madeline's phone started blowing up with calls and messages. She tried to deny it at first, tried to play it off as a misunderstanding, but the evidence was overwhelming. By the next morning, she was a pariah. The friends she had spent years cultivating now wanted nothing to do with her. For the first time in her life, Madeline was completely alone. The thing about people like Madeline is that they never think the consequences will catch up to them. They lie, manipulate, and twist the truth to fit their own version of reality. They believe they're untouchable, that no matter what they do, they'll always come out on top. But not this time. I made sure of that. A week after I sent out the proof of her affair, Madeline was unraveling. Her so-called loyal friends had all distanced themselves from her. The school moms whispered behind her back at drop-offs. The charity board, where she once held a position of power, had asked her to step down. And the worst blow of all, Ethan had moved out, taking the kids with him. She had lost everything. But Madeline wasn't the kind of person to go down without a fight. No, she still had one last move to play. I was at work when she called. I considered ignoring it, letting her stew in the mess she'd created, but something inside me wanted to hear her out. I answered on the third ring. "You ruined my life," she said, her voice hoarse, almost unrecognizable. "No, Madeline," I replied coolly. "You did that all by yourself." She let out a sharp, bitter laugh, her voice full of disdain. "You think you're so clever, don't you? You think you've won?" "I don't need to win," I said calmly. I just needed the truth to come out. For a long moment, she was silent. Then, her voice dropped to something colder, more venomous. "You don't understand, Rebecca. You think you've taken everything from me? Fine. But you'd better watch your back because I have nothing left to lose." With that, she hung up. Most people would have been shaken by that threat, but I wasn't most people. I knew Madeline all too well. She was nothing but empty words. Still, I wasn't naive enough to let my guard slip. Not yet. Because while Madeline had lost her reputation, her marriage, and the perfect life she'd spent so long crafting, there was still one thing she had left. The house. I didn't need the money, but I needed to finish what I'd started. So I called Ethan. "Do you still have the original will?" I asked, my voice steady. "Yeah," he answered, confusion lacing his words. "Why?" I smiled to myself. "Because it's time to fix what Madeline broke." It took a few more weeks, but eventually, my lawyer filed the case. Madeline had fraudulently altered legal documents, a serious crime. The evidence was overwhelming, and with Ethan's testimony, she didn't stand a chance. The court ruled in my favor, reinstating my parents' original wishes. That meant half of everything, including the house, now belonged to me. I'll never forget the look on Madeline's face when the sheriff showed up with the eviction notice. "You can't do this!" she screamed, her voice shrill with fury. "This isn't your house anymore," I said, standing in the doorway. "You took everything from me, Madeline, and now I'm just taking back what's mine." She trembled, fists clenched, her body rigid with anger. "Where am I supposed to go?" she whispered, her eyes wide with panic. I tilted my head slightly. "I guess you'll have to be independent now." Then, with the sweetest smile I could muster, I handed her my last gift, an old, used bicycle, the same one my parents had given me for my 16th birthday. I turned and walked back inside, closing the door firmly behind me, leaving her standing there alone. For the first time in her life, Madeline had no one to turn to. And for the first time in mine, I was truly free. The house was quiet, peaceful for the first time in years. I walked through its rooms without feeling like I didn't belong. No more sharp, disapproving looks or hushed conversations about how I couldn't measure up to Madeline. It was mine now, not just in name, but in every way that mattered. Yet, as I stood in the grand living room surrounded by lavish furniture and meticulously curated decor, I felt nothing. This place had never been a home to me. It had been a battleground, a symbol of all that had been denied to me. I knew what I had to do next. I put the house on the market the very next day, not for revenge, not for profit, but because I needed a fresh start. This house had been Madeline's domain, my parents' shrine to their ideal daughter, and I wanted no part of it. I watched from a distance as the for sale sign was planted into the yard, and for the first time, I didn't feel like I was losing something. I felt like I was winning. Madeline, however, wasn't doing so well. I heard through mutual acquaintances that she was falling apart. Ethan had full custody of the kids, and without him to bankroll her lifestyle, she was quickly unraveling. The last time I saw her, she was renting a tiny apartment on the outskirts of town, working a dead-end job she hated. For the first time in her life, there was no one to catch her when she fell, no doting parents, no adoring social circle. She was living the kind of life she'd always looked down on. But the funny thing? I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel guilty either. I just felt done. The money I inherited from my parents' estate? I donated most of it. Not out of bitterness, but because I had built my life without relying on their help, and I didn't need their wealth to define me. I kept just enough to start over somewhere new, a different city, a completely different life. One where I wasn't just Rebecca, the forgotten daughter. Just Rebecca. A week before I left town, Aunt Gloria invited me over for dinner. She had been the only family member who truly stood by me through everything. As we sat together, she reached for my hand. "You know," she said softly, smiling, "your parents were wrong about you." I raised an eyebrow. "Oh." "They always thought you were the one who didn't need them, that you were too strong, too independent. But the truth is, they needed you." I frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" She sighed. "They built their entire world around Madeline because she needed to be propped up. She needed their validation, their approval, their constant support. But you thrived despite them, and that terrified them." Her words sank in deep, and I realized she might be right. Maybe my parents had never ignored me because I wasn't good enough. Maybe they ignored me because they knew I didn't need them the way Madeline did. And for the first time, that thought didn't hurt. That night, as I packed the last of my belongings, I looked one final time at my old room. The girl who used to live here, the one who had spent years trying to prove she was worthy, was gone. In her place stood a woman who had nothing left to prove. I picked up my bags, walked out the door, and never looked back. Because my past didn't define me. My future did.